I just want to say that the timing of our event today is not coincidental. October 22nd, one of the last days of a week of action. This is our contribution in Hamilton to the North American Week of Action to Fund Peace, Not War, organized by the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network in Canada and by UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition south of the border. They're calling for US citizens to go back to the streets and stop US wars. There's over 60 actions across North America and the world. We'll give you the sponsor information soon. You have schedules and timetables in your registration package. Hopefully you picked one up at the table back there. And if you didn't, you can go back and get one. There's the blocks of time for Q&A. And we're using the teach-in format because we want to entertain a broad and open discussion. So here we are on a Saturday morning on a college campus, and you're all here. So that's amazing, 10 a.m. Saturday on a campus. And so we're so pleased about that. I'd have you give yourselves a round of applause, but you can save that for Kevin. You can save that for Kevin. I'll introduce him. Kevin is a professor right here at Mohawk College in Hamilton. And he researches, writes, and teaches on the subjects of civilization collapse, political transformation, and global systemic risk. In 2017, he published Radical Transformation, Oligarchy, Collapse, and the Crisis of Civilization with Between the Lines books. Actually, I was there. I'm in the photo, I guess, on Facebook of that. So he is currently working on a book entitled A New Ecological Politics with Oregon State University Press. And Kevin also serves as vice president of the Mohawk Faculty Union, OPSU Local 240. So let's give a warm welcome to Kevin. Come on up.
Thanks very much, Brendan, for that very kind introduction, and amazing to see folks here. I think it's a very important thing that people come out on a gorgeous Saturday morning to talk about issues that are heavy issues. There is a lot going on in the world right now that is concerning and that needs this kind of open debate and discourse. So, and I just want to say, Brendan said that I'm a professor here at Mohawk College. I'm speaking on my behalf, not on Mohawk College's behalf. I think that's an important thing for me to mention. But I'm also, I'm here because I really think that free speech is a very, very important cornerstone value of democratic societies. And so I think open and critical debate is what is needed to solve the serious problems of our time. And these include things like war, economic inequality, global climate change. You know, we could go down a list of very, very serious issues that we're facing right now as a human community. But yeah, free speech is very important. And there hasn't been that much of it around the conflict that's been unfolding in Ukraine, the broader conflict between NATO, Russia, and China. So that's why we're here today, is to talk about these things. And in particular, what I want to do in my talk is, the title of the talk is Deconstructing the Western Narrative on Ukraine. And so I'm going to see if I have some slides. Oops, I don't think it's clicking through. There we go. That's awesome. Thank you, folks. So deconstructing the Western narrative on Ukraine. So what I want to talk about here is the fact that we have been given a very specific, I'm just going to move that water before it falls. We've been given a very specific narrative of the conflict that's unfolding in Ukraine. And when I say we, I mean kind of the collective West. So certainly in Canada and the United States, a lot of the countries of Europe as well. And the version that we're getting is pretty straightforward. You know, it's some idea that on February 24th of this year, Russia launched an illegal invasion of Ukraine. And I think on that point, there's not a lot of disagreement. I mean, Russia did invade Ukraine. You know, it is a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. It is, you know, they call it a special military operation. It's kind of a war by any other name. And so, you know, that's what we're dealing with on the face of it. And yet, beyond that, we're also told that it was a completely unprovoked invasion. All of a sudden, Russia just rolled into Ukraine February 24th. Started this war of aggression. If we're given any motive at all for the war, it usually boils down to some psychological evaluation of Russian President Vladimir Putin, either that he's a madman or that he's, pining for the lost Russian Empire. That's pretty much it. Aside from that, we've basically been told that Russia is just sort of engaging in a naked war of aggression. And because of that framing, I think we're also given a very simple response. Well, what do you do against a country that just launches a naked war of aggression, invades another country for absolutely no reason? Well, clearly you can't negotiate with them. You can't sit down and try and work things out. You have to defeat them utterly and completely. You have to militarily defeat the aggressing nation, right? And this is something that I think, on a certain level makes sense. There's a certain coherence to that, right? If we take this idea that this is a completely unprovoked attack. And I want to just take this moment right now to say that I'm speaking as someone who is not just an academic who studies this stuff, but as a peace activist. I think war is possibly the most destructive, anti-human, ecocidal thing that human beings engage in. I'm completely opposed to it. I'm completely opposed to the war in Ukraine. I think it's tragic and horrendous, the suffering that's happening there. Ukrainian citizens dying, the Ukrainian soldiers and the Russian soldiers and the Russian citizens. All of it, I think, is a horrible tragedy. But I think that in order to bring a tragedy like this to an end, we have to understand how it actually happened. Because if you don't understand how a conflict started, you're not going to understand how to end it. So this is what I want to focus on in my talk. And what I'm going to do, first of all, is just go through really quickly what I'm going to be discussing. So I'm going to just spend a little bit of time, and not a lot, just talking about this whole idea of, Putin's motives, what we can impute, right, about Putin's motives. Then I'm going to more substantively look at, how did the war start? What are some precipitating incidents that we may want to consider that explain how this conflict broke out? Then I want to talk just a little bit about how the war has progressed since it has broken out, especially in relation to the strategy that the collective West has taken towards the war. What has that done? Has it led us closer to peace or further away from it? Finally, I just have a few closing remarks on how I think we can end the war. So, like I said, I'm going to be very quick in this question of Putin's motives. I mean, I think it's a tendency of Western media and political discourse. Anytime we're in a conflict with another nation, we tend to want to reduce the conflict to the demonization of the leader, right, of the other country. There's a long and storied history of this. And it's not to say that some of the people that the collective West has been in conflict with have not been abhorrent characters. And one could maybe say this about Vladimir Putin. He's certainly an authoritarian. He's certainly a ruthless leader and politician. However, I'm going to submit that there is no evidence to the effect that he's a madman, that he's somehow a reckless, half-cocked, just doing things for no reason that aren't thought out. If anything, over his 20 years of leading the country, he's developed an international reputation as an extremely calculating, very careful, very serious politician and leader. And again, you may disagree with his motivations or what he's trying to accomplish, but in no way has he given the sense that he's some sort of unhinged madman. And so that's just something that there's no evidence for that. The evidence about whether he's somehow trying to recreate the Russian Empire is also, I would say, it's become a little more complicated now that there's been the annexation of the 4 regions of Ukraine, right? But I'm going to return to that later on in the talk. I would submit that up until this conflict broke out, again, there was no evidence to that effect. When you looked at how Putin actually operated in the world, especially geopolitically, you didn't see evidence that he was trying to militarily dominate Ukraine, that he was trying to expand the Russian Empire through military means. And I want to just be clear at this point that, Russia is a powerful state. China is a powerful state. The US is a powerful state. All powerful states exert influence beyond their borders. All of them extend their interests beyond their borders. So there's no pure moral actors on the world, on the global stage, on the international stage, right? I just want to make that really clear. So I'm saying that about Russia, China, the U.S., every country that is active in the world today, right? However, there's just no evidence that he was seeking to rebuild the Russian Empire. So I want to park that for a minute now, and let's talk about some of the missing pieces, I would say, of the Western story of the Ukraine war. So I'd like to sort of segue into how did the war start. Now, one of the big missing pieces when Western media and Western politicians have discussed this war is, and this is really a yawning chasm of a missing piece, is there's no mention of the geopolitical interests of the United States or of NATO in terms of discussing this conflict. And so what this tends to do is it tends to make the whole narrative not make sense, right? This is where, again, people fall back on, well, it must be because Putin's crazy, because otherwise there was no reason for this invasion to happen. There was no precipitating cause. When we factor in the interests of the United States and NATO, things become, I think, a little more complicated, but usefully complicated, not in a negative sense. And, you know, the big missing piece is that, you know, the United States in the world today is basically an imperial power. It is a country that exerts its influence, its interests across the globe to an extent far greater than any other country. Okay. And like I said before, Russia and China, they're also powerful states. They also do meddle in the affairs of the countries around them. I think it's a fantasy to assume they don't. But they don't do it in the way the United States does, not to the extent and not with the use of military force, the regular use of military force. So, you know, for the past 20 years, we've seen such things as the 1999 NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, the 2001 US invasion of Afghanistan, of course, supported by Canada and a number of other NATO allies, the 2002 US-backed coup attempt in Venezuela, 2003 US invasion of Iraq, 2004 Canadian American-backed coup in Haiti. And of course, we're in Haiti again right now, Canada and the United States. Again, not with the blessing of the populace there against their committed opposition. The 2009 American-backed coup in Honduras, the 2011 overthrow of Libya's government by NATO members, and the 2011 US-backed attempt to overthrow the Syrian government, which of course that conflict continues to this day. I mean, the Americans occupy a large extent of the Syrian state, about a third of the Syrian state. We never hear about this in Western media sources, though. So there is a long history of this kind of behavior of the United States engaging in severe violations of the sovereignty of other countries, you know, invasions, bombings, you name it. American professor William Bloom wrote an essential book, I think, if anyone wants to understand American foreign policy. It's called Killing Hope. And in this book, Bloom points out that since World War II, over 70 times the United States has actively overthrown the government of another country. Not always through military force, sometimes through other covert means, through economic war, through sabotage, through covert operations. Right? So the US is not a neutral party on the global stage. This is left out of the Western narrative on Ukraine. And I think this is a really important point that we need to first of all address. You know, related to this as well is the idea that US foreign policy since World War II has been explicitly about controlling the world, quite literally, full spectrum dominance. There's been different names used to describe this by, you know, US State Department and Pentagon officials, but it's pretty out in the open. You can access these documents, you can read them. There's this very clear sense that the US post-World War II, they came out of it unscathed, incredibly powerful economically and militarily. They had nuclear weapons, no one else did. And they really, in that moment, chose to assert control over the rest of the world. Immediately, of course, they came into conflict with Russia and China. And immediately, nuclear threats began against Russia. And so this is something that I think we really have to appreciate. I'm just going to check and see, okay, great, my clicker's working. So, and this relates also to NATO, but so post-World War II, the United States wants to project their power internationally. And they see Russia and China as enemies, obviously the communist regimes, the Soviet Union. And, but the military, or sorry, the nuclear threats began immediately from the United States. Detailed plans are drawn up about how to completely obliterate Russia. Several drafts, right? You know, 1948, 1949. 1949, NATO was created. And NATO was created explicitly as a military alliance to oppose and to eventually destroy the Soviet Union. And so this is sort of the backdrop to our current moment. And, you know, Russia, I would argue that in 1949, when they were able to successfully test a nuclear weapon, that probably saved them from annihilation. I think that if Russia hadn't been able to establish a nuclear capability themselves, you know, it's very, very likely that the United States would have used nuclear weapons. They're the only country in the world who has used nuclear weapons, you know, obliterating 2 civilian populations in Japan. So we have to remember this. Again, you're not going to hear this in Western media accounts of the conflict today. So that's the situation. And of course, you have a Cold War that develops between Russia and the Americans. And what's known as the balance of terror emerges, where both sides are able to destroy the other through the use of nuclear weapons. And then, you know, luckily, not shortly after, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, cooler heads start to prevail, and you start to see nuclear treaties being signed between the two powers. People start realizing we're really at the brink of, you know, destroying human civilizations. We know it. Let's back it off. The START treaties are signed. Non-proliferation treaties are signed. Anti-ballistic missile treaties are signed. And we start backing away from the brink of nuclear Armageddon. And, you know, this is basically the Cold War, how it plays out, and in the nuclear arms race and a number of other factors, you know, partly due to its internal contradictions, the Soviet Union collapses in the early 1990s. And when this is happening, Mikhail Gorbachev, who's, you know, the person that these first negotiations are happening with NATO, he says, you know what, okay, yeah, it's time. We're going to let this go. We want a new architecture for international relations. The empire will cease to exist. Germany can reunify. But in these negotiations, Russia was very, very concerned about eastward expansion of NATO. This is well documented at the time. And not just Russian people saying that this would be a mistake, not just Russian politicians, but also very prominent American politicians, even military officers and whatnot in the US military saying, okay, you know, the Union's going to dissolve. We won. America won the Cold War, essentially, right? So now is the time to allow Europe to reestablish a new peace and to not expand eastward. And there was an actual literal promise. This has been proven. Some media accounts will try and say that this is somehow bogus, that the US promised that they wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward beyond Germany. They certainly did. And of course, we know what happened. They certainly went against that promise. So over serious, strenuous Russian objection, Boris Yeltsin, you know, several communiques was saying, you know, this is a serious problem. You can't do this. U.S. did it anyway. NATO did it anyway, and all of these Eastern European countries become NATO members. You know, throughout the later 90s into the 2000s. And in 2007, Vladimir Putin gave a speech at an international security conference. And in the speech, he was very, very clear about the fact that what he saw was a unipolar expression of power, of force from the United States and its allies. And he pointed out, of course, numerous conflicts, right? Iraq still raging, Afghanistan still raging at this point in 2007. And, you know, Putin said, one power seems to do whatever it wants with impunity. This is an important point too, right? All of these crimes, all of these interventions by the United States, seemingly with impunity. International law doesn't seem to apply to the global hegemon, to the country with the most power, the most military might. And Putin said, you know what? I don't think this is the right way to go. I think also we're really, really concerned about what's going on in Eastern Europe. You know, NATO cannot come right to our borders. Ukraine cannot become a part of NATO. So he kind of draws that line really firmly. And you got to remember, this is a fallback line. The original line was don't expand eastward. Now they're just like, don't expand right up to our borders. Again, shortly after 2008, George Bush says, you know, we're gonna bring Ukraine into NATO, right? And so the pressure keeps ratcheting up. Along with this too, and this is something that often isn't talked about, is the United States starts unilaterally withdrawing from nuclear weapons treaties with Russia, withdrawing from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, withdrawing from other treaties to limit, you know, medium-range nuclear weapons. And so you got to think from the Russian perspective, you know, and part of the issue I think with a one-sided narrative is you don't take into account the perspective of the other side. And not to say that that perspective is necessarily true or fully accurate either, but you have to at least understand it. So from the Russian side of things, first of all, they see that they can't trust NATO and the collective West. They can't trust their word. NATO's going to go right up to their borders. Russia or the United States is going to ramp up the nuclear threat. They're going to withdraw from treaties. And they're going to also start to endorse this idea of a nuclear first strike. So the rhetoric in the United States changes. Their idea that they once more want to use nuclear weapons when they want, not just defensively. So all of these things, this is the backdrop sort of leading up to the situation in Ukraine. So the situation intensifies. You've got, again, treaties being withdrawn from, you have NATO pressure moving right up. You have this call by the United States for Ukraine to join NATO. And then in 2014, the US and NATO really find their opportunity. And the opportunity was in the Euromaidan. Again, if you're a Western Ukrainian nationalist, you call it a glorious revolution against corruption and tyranny. If you're an Eastern Ukrainian, you call it a coup with definite far-right and neo-Nazi connections. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that because that's something too the West has tried to whitewash, right? So in 2014, this coup breaks out and the US involvement and fingerprints are all over it. There is, Victoria Nuland, right, who is, official in U.S. State Department, bragged that since the early 90s up until 2014, the U.S. had invested over $5 billion in Ukraine, $5 billion in building opposition, in creating an infrastructure to eventually overthrow the government and install a government favorable to the West. There's also evidence that USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, all the usual US NGOs that fund regime change were very active in Ukraine leading up to the Euromaidan protests. In fact, all of the offices of these agencies are right in the US Embassy in Ukraine. And so right from the get-go, there was involvement by the United States. And again, Euromaidan is a complex thing. Was Ukrainian politics corrupt at the time? Evidence points to yes, it was. Was the current, President Viktor Yanukovych some sort of saintly being? No, I don't think he was. However, I think an objective look at the evidence shows that actually Yanukovych was really trying to walk a tightrope. He was trying to enact a balancing routine, which most Ukrainian politicians had to do, between the interests of Russia, that they're a powerful neighbor, and the interests of the West, another powerful neighbor, that they wanted to gain closer ties to. So Ukraine was always a bit of a balancing act politically between these two forces, and had tried with some degree of success since the early 90s to strike this balance. Well, this all got pushed over, and instead you had a far-right coup that happened. And at the time of the Euromaidan as well, if you look at polls of Ukrainian citizens, all Ukrainian citizens, not just in the West, people were very divided as to whether they even supported Maidan. Like, support literally hinging around the 50% mark, okay? And same thing about whether they wanted to join NATO or not. Ukraine was deeply divided over this, because another thing that's left out of the narrative is that Ukraine itself is a deeply politically divided country, right? There are, in the East, about a third of the country consider themselves to be ethnic Russians. About 2/3 of the country speak Russian on a regular basis. And so after the Euromaidan coup, this division really hardened in the country. And you then had these two easternmost regions in the Donbass seeking independence because it was clear to them that the government that came into power after the coup in 2014 was not friendly to Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And so what happens is a civil war breaks out in Ukraine between Ukrainians. And again, this is something that the West tries to spin it as, oh, the Russians somehow started a civil war in Ukraine and they invaded the Donbass, and it's completely ridiculous. What happened is you had an oppressive government come into power in Kiev that was hostile to Russian speakers, that immediately tried to outlaw the Russian language, that enacted other oppressive measures. Folks in the East, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, said, we want no part of this, we want autonomy. And then immediately what happened is they were attacked by the Western Ukrainians, by the Kiev government. And I want to just bring out at this point, this is a really important concept that, again, doesn't get talked about in the narrative, is that Under the UN Charter, people have a right to self-determination. Okay, so if a group of people, within a nation state, if an ethnic region or a political region or whatever, if they decide that they want to be independent, there's supposed to be a process that happens. It's supposed to be respected under international law. I mean, yes, you want to have proper referenda. You want to make sure that things are democratically handled. But the polar opposite occurred in Ukraine. They were immediately attacked, and then a war breaks out and a war starts raging. So that's a huge trigger, obviously, to the current conflict. Another thing that happens, obviously, is Russia immediately annexes Crimea when this conflict breaks out. And the one thing I'll say about this is obviously the history of Crimea is very very complicated. It was part of Russia for a long period of time. The people in Crimea clearly identify as Russian, as Russian speaking. There was a lot of condemnation in the collective West, and it's understandable. They could say, oh, well, it was a referendum done at gunpoint. But what's interesting is if you look a few years after the Crimean annexation, American polling companies, like Gallup and Ipsos Reid, like mainstream American polling companies, went into Crimea and did broad polls of the populace. Said, are you happy that you're a member of Russia? And it was like 86% of people said yes. So, legalities aside of what happened in Crimea, it is a myth that Russia just all of a sudden went in there and captured territory. Technically what Crimea did is voted for independence and then voted to join Russia. And that's actually how it sort of played out on the ground. But anyway, the collective West used this as an example to say Russia's imperialist, Putin wants all of Ukraine, this sort of thing. The post-coup government became increasingly problematic in Ukraine. The ties to the far right were explicit. And again, there are some people that say, oh, Ukrainian government's all Nazis. Well, that's absurd. That's not the case. But there are also some people in the collective West that like to pretend that there's simply no neo-Nazi presence, no far-right presence in the Ukrainian government. That's equally absurd. Simply not the case. And what's really interesting to look at is if you look at articles published in Western publications since from 2014 until right before the war broke out in February 2024, there's countless publications talking about Ukraine's neo-Nazi problem, talking about Azov, talking about all of these paramilitary organizations, not just becoming increasingly active and effectual in Ukraine, but also training far-right groups from across the world, literally. Like Ukraine became a training ground for these sorts of forces, and we don't hear about that. And it's often glossed over the fact that this might be an issue for Russian-speaking Ukrainians, that there are people, for instance, who are trying to rehabilitate Stepan Bandera, Ukrainian nationalist, ultra-nationalist hero, allied with the Nazis in World War II. So this context is left out, that there were real reasons the people in the Donbass did not feel safe, right? There are real reasons why they would have wanted autonomy. So instead what happens, I'm falling behind here in my clicking. Instead what happens is war breaks out. Instead of any kind of negotiation, there's just a conflict. And in the course of this conflict, over 10,000 civilians are killed, over 4,000 military personnel. The Donbass is shelled relentlessly, so people there just kind of can't even undergo their regular lives. And none of this is talked about in terms of how this might have precipitated the conflict. Another important thing to discuss is that a peace agreement was on the table very early on when the war started. In 2014, the Minsk agreements were basically agreed on. And it was France and Germany were brokering this. Russia signed on to these peace agreements. And originally, Ukraine signed on as well. And what the Minsk agreements were for, this is something we have to remember, the Minsk agreements left the Donbass part of Ukraine, but autonomous regions within Ukraine. So this is an interesting thing to think about. Again, if the Russians were always imperialists in this war, why would they sign on to a peace agreement in 2014 that gave them zero territory? But what it ensured was that the people in the Donbass would actually be, safe and protected, and that conflict would end. It seemed at that moment what Russia was trying to do was avoid war at all costs, was trying to de-escalate the war. So the Minsk I agreements were not implemented by Ukraine. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the government of Ukraine wanted to implement them, but they were getting a lot of pressure, again, from the far-right elements in their government, like literally death threats. Petro Poroshenko in 2015, you had the far-right, Svoboda, Pravy Sector, Azov, all of these organizations making death threats on the president, basically saying, if you sign these agreements, in 2015, there was the Minsk II agreements. They were saying, if you sign these agreements, there's going to be another Maidan, but it's going to be you that we take out of power. So again, the political situation in Ukraine was incredibly complicated and divisive, and there was the real threat of political violence, which was a driving decision. So tragically, all of this could have ended in 2014 and 2015 with autonomous regions in Ukraine with full territorial integrity. But that's not what happened, we know. Instead, things continue to escalate. And so, just before I wrap up this section here, yeah, it's like my clicker is not quite working here. But there were some events that immediately precipitated the invasion on the 24th. So you had very belligerent statements being made by Ukraine. You know, we're taking over Crimea. You know, we're gonna take back the Donbass. You had Russia coming to the United States in December of last year with a detailed peace plan saying, like, we really need to do this. Things are getting out of hand. And you have the US instead doubling down on, you know, Ukraine coming into NATO. Things come to a head. February 24th, Russia decides to invade. So with these other facts in mind, I think that when we revisit the Western narrative on the Ukraine war, and this complete lack of mentioning of US interests, of NATO interests, of the broader geopolitical context, it doesn't make sense. It just seems like some crazy person invaded another country. I think when you look at the actual facts, you see that, again, and I want to be very careful here. I'm not trying to say an invasion was justified. I don't support the invasion. I don't support war. However, you arrive at a point where you see that this conflict was set up meticulously for years. A trap was set meticulously for years. Ukraine was turned into a weapon aimed directly at Russia. Vladimir Putin, some people might say he took the bait. Some people might say he had no choice. It's hard to say. But if you remove that from the conflict, then you don't really understand, I think, how to deal with it and how to possibly resolve it. So I want to talk a little bit about what's happened since the invasion. What have we seen? Let's see if am I clicking effective? Oh, that's great. Thank you. What have we seen since the invasion? Well, first of all, we've seen the escalation of conflict. So this is under the Western approach of massively sanctioning Russia, of billions of dollars of weapons flooding into the country, not just from the United States, but from other NATO member countries. And again, the idea is you have to utterly defeat Russia. French finance minister said we have to cause the Russian economy to collapse. They were very, very clear about this. So that was the modus operandi. What did it lead to? Massive escalation of the conflict. Again, think about it. Before this started in 2014, Ukraine had full territorial integrity, right? After the invasion as well, right after the invasion, there were negotiations happening. Hopefully we'll remember this, right? In March. And in March, they basically had a peace agreement done. Russia had agreed, Ukraine had agreed. And again, in this peace agreement, the Donbass would be independent. So, the goalposts have moved a little bit. They wouldn't just be autonomous regions within Ukraine, because I think all parties realized that ship had sailed. But the peace agreement was for the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, to be independent republics. And the people involved in negotiating that, I think, have been very clear about what happened to that deal. And that is that the UK and the United States, NATO, came in and said, no, you're not going to sign this. They said this to Zelensky. That's why Zelensky, too, is a complex figure. He can sometimes be seen as really intransigent, but really at times he was ready to make peace. He was ready to try and avert an escalation. But that's not what happened. Tragically, that's not what happened. So from that point, now we're at a point where Ukraine has lost almost 20% of its country, tens of thousands of soldiers killed on both sides, thousands of civilians, massive destruction of infrastructure. You know, you also see a serious escalation of nuclear rhetoric from both sides. You see this unbelievable event of the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. And again, this is terrifying. If you think about the precedent this sets under international law, that massive critical energy infrastructure of the country can just be destroyed like that. I don't think there's a lot of serious debate about who destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines. I'm not going to stand up here and say that I have fingerprints that I've seen on the pipeline. Let's just say I don't think anyone seriously thinks it was Russia that blew up their own pipeline. If they wanted to control the flow of gas to Europe, there's a tap. They can turn it on and off without destroying billions of dollars worth of their own infrastructure. So anyway, but what does that show? What does that show if either the United States or one of its allies will do that? Scary stuff. You have the Russian annexations, Ukrainian counteroffensives, massive war mobilization now in Russia, and also massive missile strikes on infrastructure all throughout Ukraine. So things are escalating far, far beyond what any of us ever hoped or wanted to see. And this really does seem to be a spiral of escalation. So I think to end up, what I will talk about a little bit is just what can we do in the face of this, in the face of these events, which are, again, you know, they're happening in Europe, they're happening far away. Well, we are Canadian, most of us here are probably Canadian citizens. We're members of a NATO country, right? And I think that what's incredibly important is the evidence suggests that it's NATO that's been standing in the way of a resolution of this conflict. Left to their own devices, I think Ukraine and Russia could resolve this. NATO needs to get out of the way. NATO needs to stop thwarting peace in this region. Stop preventing a negotiated peace. This also means that NATO has to stop funding the war. They have to stop feeding this conflict. Right? And again, this I'm sure sounds controversial to a lot of people who are just familiar with the Western narrative. It's like, you know, wow, you have to defend the Ukrainians are, you know, standing up against Russian aggression. Listen, Ukrainians have a right to defend their country. I fully affirm that. However, look at what has happened since before the start of the war, full territorial integrity. Now, minus 20% of their country, with Russia about to launch a massive military operation. Right? So it is in everyone's interest for there to be a peaceful settlement immediately, a negotiated settlement. Continuing to funnel arms in Ukraine is not going to do it. So we need an immediate ceasefire. We need negotiations, serious negotiations. And again, folks, my firm belief is this could happen tomorrow if NATO allowed it. You know, there are countries, interlocutors, Turkey, you know, other countries that have tried to broker peace in the past. They're still there. They're still willing and able to do it. Even some members of the EU, France in particular, seem open to this idea of trying to get a peace there in Ukraine. So I think it's critical as Canadians that we demand that our country, as a member of NATO, that we force NATO to the negotiating table to end this conflict as soon as we possibly can. Because the danger of it escalating is simply far too great. And obviously, just the suffering right now of people in Ukraine, all the soldiers dying, all the civilians. I mean, it's an incredible tragedy. And the most tragic part is it all could have been avoided. So thank you very much, folks. I think I'll end it there. I really want there to be some questions because I think that there's certain things that I talked about that I had to go a little bit fast just because there's a lot of complexity, but certainly willing to get into the details more if people want to ask me questions on any aspect of my talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was a very carefully considered presentation. we'll be taking some questions shortly. I did see some people trickle in. I know it's a bit of a maze, so thank you all for even finding your way here. And yes, there were some late arrivals, and I just want to let you know, yes, you can go back anytime and get, I saw some nice breakfast food actually there, fruit, cookies, muffins, there's coffee, there's water on the bar area, and there are washrooms if you need them. If you go through the back door there to the left, I think it is, yeah, and down the hallway, there's men's and women's washrooms, so please help yourself to any of the facilities, food, drink, and lavatories. So I want to mention that we're using the Teach In format today because we wish to entertain a broad and open discussion. All points of view can be entertained respectfully and at the appropriate times. And we have a large number of volunteers with these lanyards, and this is our event staff, and some of them are facilitators in the event that there's any problem with the smooth unfolding of our schedule. What we want to do briefly is have a little question period because Kevin mentioned the value of doing so. After panel number 1 on Russia, Ukraine, NATO, there will of course be an extensive question period before lunch, but we want to give a little bit of space to questions right now. I'm going to give Greg the mic. He's a volunteer, and he can show you the mic to ask questions, and we might even be able to take a couple from the webinar. We might be getting some questions on the laptop, so we'll find out about that. But if you want to ask Kevin a question, oh, there's some feedback there. We'll have to stand.
Let's see. So when you had your mic on.
No.
Test 1, 2, 3. Perhaps you could speak about how Zelensky was actually elected by really the Russian population of Ukraine, promising peace, and then elements within the Ukraine basically let Zelensky know that that wasn't allowed, and he U-turned very rapidly when he understood that.
Thanks for that. So you might want to just turn it off in between, just in case, and then we'll just swap the mics being on and off. Thanks for that question. It's a good one, and I think that you're right. So Zelensky was elected on a platform of bringing an end to the war in the Donbass, right, of establishing peace. And there's some really interesting video, and I'm not sure if you've seen this or not, of him actually going to the Donbass and trying to talk to some of the units there, some of the Ukrainian ultranationalist units, and saying, listen, you've got to stop fighting, and then being like, no. And he'd be like, I'm the president, you can't just say no to me. And so there's some truth to that, the fact that there really is, and this is where, again, it's wrong to say the Ukrainian state is a Nazi state. It's wrong to say that. However, the presence of those far-right, organized, violent groups can't be underestimated in the sense that it doesn't take that many of them to affect the political landscape if they're willing to use political violence to get their way, and they clearly are. And so there's evidence that not just Zelensky was threatened by these forces, but also Poroshenko before him, right? I think we also have to factor in too that there's evidence that the United States as well was heavily working behind the scenes, right, to ensure that that peace didn't happen, right? So, but it is tragic because think about this. Last thing I'll say about this is think about what the Ukrainian people wanted in that election. To me, this is incredibly tragic. I don't think the Ukrainian people wanted this at all. This division, this escalation, this horrendous tearing apart of their country. They voted actually for a different path, you know, and was tragically denied them. So yeah, great point. Thank you. Thank you.
You provided a really good summary, which I very much agree with. However, I have a very hard time discussing this with people because it's not a summary that's understood at all by anyone, and they're being presented by complete lies. It's gone beyond misinformation. It's just complete lies. Russia's bombing themselves at Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, apparently. Russia's bombing their own billion-dollar infrastructure in Nord Stream. I don't understand how this can even be debated at this point. I would like to have a better say how to do
that. Thanks for that question. I think you're right. So one of the things that I guess we have to understand, and Professor Mearsheimer says this all the time, and it's just an important thing to remember that all governments lie during war. All governments lie during war. Certainly ours do. Certainly the collective West, Russia's government does too. And yet, I think what's been really challenging about being in the collective West is that people don't seem to realize that, and they don't seem to realize that most of what we get from mainstream media is, Michael Parenti, the great journalist, called it face value transmission. So really, you're just taking what the politicians say at face value, and you're just translating it back to the populace. You're just sort of reiterating it. So we are getting a steady stream of propaganda. We really are, and it is absurd. I hear you. Like exactly that Russia that is occupying a nuclear power plant is now shelling its own nuclear power plant. Like there's absurdity and upon absurdity, that they blow up their own pipelines. We see this too around reporting of war crimes. And again, I would say in war, all sides commit war crimes, right? I really believe that. I think the Russian forces have, the Ukrainian forces have. We never hear about the war crimes committed by the Ukrainian forces. They exist. We hear all about the ones, or the supposed ones committed by Russia. Some of them we don't know yet, right? So I understand it's challenging. I think what I would try and help people do is direct them towards some good sources of information. There are some people out there that are speaking out, I think, in a very balanced way. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs recently has been really, really interesting in terms of, I think he really understands the stakes, and he's not some sort of radical, and he's really speaking out very strongly about this issue. Obviously, there's Douglas McGregor, right? He's been getting on mainstream media every once in a while. Chomsky's, I think, good on this issue. So there are good sources out there, and that's what I try and do myself, because I know otherwise it's very difficult to try and counter that narrative.
Our question is, when it was the Soviet Union, all these different areas were changed, the government leaders changed the borders, who's where belongs, which actually, that was done to control the population. So Ukraine got all these areas, which were really Russian people. And so when the fell apart, all those borders stayed as is. For example, somebody that was studying in Belarus, going to school, when it split, she was no longer Russian, she was Belarus. And that happened, and that created a huge problem. So it's not just the neo-Nazi or whatever, it's just caused the whole problem. And that's where all this coming from. And then they want to control the population, which is very difficult to control because you can't tell people where to belong, basically. So, and I think that has to be included as well. Thanks.
Thank you. You're exactly right. And I think one of the interesting things when you hear Putin talk about the dissolution of the Soviet Union, this has been used in the West. He's misquoted all the time, deliberately. And, he wrote an article, and I believe it was 2017, 2018, very interesting article, historical, about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And exactly what you said, he called it a tragedy because to him, the tragedy was you had Russian-speaking people all of a sudden overnight were outside of the borders, right? So you had all of these countries where there were people who considered themselves Russian, but they were no longer part of Russia. And so he said, this is a real problem. And this is the article too, where he's often quoted as saying, and Ukrainians were like brothers. I don't see any difference between us, right? And the West, when they quote this, they say, oh, that proves that Putin that says Ukraine doesn't even exist. Literally 2 lines later, he says, but of course, Ukraine is its own country. What's the future of Ukraine? It's up to Ukrainians to decide, right? But that part is never quoted. But you're right. Historically speaking, we're dealing with some complex legacy of the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And that's partly why you have these minority Russian-speaking populations in various countries, and it's driving tension, driving conflict for sure.
Thanks for an excellent presentation, Kevin. You cut through a lot of the misconceptions Can you, I don't know whether this is within the realm of what you're doing, but can you speak to what kinds of measures have been taken in Canada, in the United States, and other parts of NATO to ensure that people don't get a full story?
Thanks, Don. Yeah, you're getting to the heart of, I think, one of the issues is the information war in this conflict has been suffocating. I remember Chomsky even remarking that he's never seen it this bad in all his years of taking a principled stance against war. What are those tangible ways? I mean, I think there's been a lot of censorship. There's certainly been censorship in terms of online platforms, in terms of Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, Instagram, whatever, in terms of content being deleted. I know there's also been attacks on journalists. I mean, there was recently a publication, and I'm going to forget. It's a university on the West Coast. I think it's either University of Alberta or anyway, some academics there published a study on the greatest purveyors of misinformation. And it was this really hackneyed, like from an academic perspective, it's horrible research. And what they basically did is they rounded up all of the dissidents, who were speaking out against the war. And they published this hit piece research that basically said these people are foreign agents, right? So I think there's been an increase in that kind of discourse, right? The idea that if you say the sorts of things I say, that I'm somehow a Russian propagandist or something like that, I think that discourse is really elevated. In other countries, it's gotten really intense. I mean, I don't know if people have followed in Germany, Alina Litt, a young journalist there who's been covering the situation in the Donbass. And she's been charged in absentia and sentenced to 3 years in prison simply for suggesting that there's a different narrative to the Ukraine war. She's a very young woman. She's only like 15 years old or something like that. And I think in the broader spectrum, you have to look at what's happening to Julian Assange, right? Edward Snowden. I mean, there's a real attempt to control discourse in the West. I mean, we look at, so for instance, I mean, offend folks here, but I'm going to say it. The Chinese system is an authoritarian system when it comes to information dissemination. It's well understood, it's well known. Russia is similar that way. But I think what we're realizing more and more is so are we. It just happens in different ways. And I think that it's very concerning. So thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, Kevin, we have a couple questions from the webinar. So first of all, from JM Tao, how can we, the average citizen, contribute to putting pressure on our government to advocate for peace in this conflict?
Thanks very much for that question. That's a great question. I think there's a few different things we can do. I think that we have to educate ourselves, right? So try and get clear ourselves what we think about things. I mean, we have to be critical of all the sources of information, including me, right? Do your research, find out what's going on. That's thing number one. Thing number two is have conversations with the people around you, your own network, whether that's just face-to-face or social media, whatever, but, try and have those conversations. I think we also have to start pressuring our political parties and our government. I think it's tragic that right now there's not many political voices at all that are anti-imperialist in Canada. There's maybe a handful in the Green Party, I think there's a few NDP members who are covertly anti-imperialist, but they're not able to step forward and really bring it to the forefront. This is a huge problem. So we can pressure our politicians, most definitely. And I think that's really important. The other thing too is, I mean, everyone here, everyone on the webinar, everyone who showed up, showing up to events and helping to rebuild an anti-war movement. It seems like anti-war movements are constantly needing to be built and rebuilt over time, right? That's okay. We can do that. And so I think that those are things that I would suggest that are tangible ways that that we can start shifting this.
Great, thank you so much. We also have a question from Christy. What would you consider to be a decent news source or sources for this war, especially considering, like you mentioned, the amount of propaganda we're fed through Western news sources?
That's a good one. I have to be super careful here. when I in my classes, with my students when I talk about sources of information, how to find a good media source. I say one thing, which is that every source is biased, every single source, and that doesn't mean that they're all all the same in other ways in terms of how credible they are, how knowledgeable. The important thing is to understand the bias of the source, right? And then figure out whether they're credible. Are they a good faith actor, or are they just, a government agent or something like that, right? But having said that, so I'm going to give you some sources that I think are really good. They each have their own bias, so you have to take that into account. The first one would be the Gray Zone. I think has done excellent work on this conflict and does excellent work on imperialist issues around the world. There's great independent journalists like Eva Bartlett, Vanessa Beeley, that are doing great work on this issue. There's a really interesting channel called the Duran. I don't know if folks are familiar with Alex and Alexander. I think they do really good work on this. There are Democracy Now! Has come around. They didn't start in a good place, I don't think, on this conflict, but you're starting to see a few news sources get a little better on it. There are a number of voices. I mean, one thing that to me I find challenging is I'm on the political left, full disclosure, right? I'm not seeing a lot of as many sources on the left, I would say, that are doing good work on this. And so some of the sources that I might mention, for instance, like Redacted or something like that, they're doing good work on this. They're probably coming at things from a more right-wing libertarian perspective. I would probably have heavy disagreements with these folks on other issues. But on the issue of war and imperialism, they're being quite good, So I think that that's a good thing. There's also the aggregators are good. Common Dreams, you can find some good articles. Sometimes Counterpunch, you can find some good articles. Chris Hedges, I think is doing good work. Mint Press, Zero Hedge, this sort of stuff. I mean, there's a lot of different sites that are out there. But it's a great question.
We might be able to take one more from the floor if you want to.
Thank you. And thank you for your talk. I think you did a really excellent job laying out the framework. And as you were talking, so many thoughts were coming to my head, and I'm trying to consolidate it into a question. But I just wanted to jump off on some sources to add, because I think what you're saying that a lot of these sources that are really good on giving information about the war in Ukraine often do come from maybe a right-wing libertarian on other issues, like the Duran, I would argue, is the same. But Brian Berletic of the New Atlas also does really fantastic analysis, as well as Scott Ritter. And from a left-leaning perspective, another voice that regularly covers Ukraine is The Left Lens with Danny Haifong. So I encourage people to check out his work as well. But in terms of some of the things that you were talking about, I was wondering if first you could speak to a little bit more about Zelensky's call for nuclear arms. I'm not sure if you saw his appeal recently, and how the Western media is now talking about doing tactical nuclear strikes. This is incredibly dangerous and scary. I think it just shows that he either doesn't know what he's talking about, or like actively working against his own interests. What you think the state of Ukraine will be? Will Ukraine survive this? I know Scott Ritter has somewhat predicted that he doesn't think Ukraine is going to survive this. What the future of Europe is going to look like? Why are they actively working against their own interests? Maybe facilitating the Nord Stream. And just one point, you gave all this context about why Russia, is clearly afraid for the sovereignty of their nation, that they are probably at risk of being balkanized, much like Yugoslavia. So I'm just wondering, what do you think? There's so much talk about how even people that are against this war say that they don't encourage like Russia invasion. I know you mentioned that, but what choice did Russia have? Like, is it really a productive thing to even front that, saying that I don't support war, I don't support invasion, like you said, but is that, what else could they have done? You laid so perfectly out why they are doing what they're doing. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
There's like 50 good points you made there. No, it's really good. I'll start with the last one first. I'm not sure what else could have been done. I have to be real about that. Russia was in a corner, very much so. And I think every serious geopolitical analyst understands that. And I think they were placed there very deliberately. So I hear you. You know, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the other option would have been for them. I also think that you're right. The sort of the geopolitics that we're seeing play out is fascinating in the sense that it does seem like Europe is almost committing suicide over this. It's really, really bizarre. And a lot of people have commented on this. And of course, we're seeing protests across Europe, right? We're seeing people hitting the streets. We're seeing anti-NATO protests, and it's understandable because it really does seem like their leadership and EU leadership, van der Leyen, all these people are really selling out the economic future, right, of Europe. I mean, the energy crisis that they're facing right now, the destruction of Nord Stream. You know, to think that an ally would do that to your country's energy security, it's very, very scary, I think. And I think that, I guess what I'll do is I'll maybe pivot a little bit because I wanted to end on this. So we're obviously seeing a geopolitical realignment that is like generational, right? This is huge, what's happening. You know, Russia, one of the things I think it absolutely had to do, and it did, was it needed to block up with China in order to fight off this imperial aggression from the United States. So you're seeing this massive polarization into camps, right? The quote unquote collective West, you know, Russia, China, India, you know, if you're looking at how they're voting, in this, you know, UN resolutions, Security Council. So the West is really isolated on this. It's funny. And if you read Western media, they want you to think that Russia's totally isolated. The whole world's behind it. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is deeply polarizing. I mean, even look at what happened recently when Biden went to Saudi, you know, to try and get MBS on side in terms of increasing oil production. He said, no. Like, when would the Saudis have said that in recent memory? When would the Saudis have agreed to take payments for oil in Chinese and Russian currency, right? So we are witnessing a huge, huge shift geopolitically. And I do think that as scary as that is, and as fraught, because you're right, Zelensky says, give us nuclear weapons. The US is ramping up this nuclear rhetoric. It is a very dangerous time. But I think it's because you're seeing the twilight of an empire, of one empire, and you're seeing the emergence of multipolarity, right? Which is in itself maybe not an ideal state, but I would argue it's better than a unipolar state where you have one country operating under the mad delusion that it can rule the world, right? And I want to be careful, one segment of one country. Most Americans want no part of this, right? Which is to me very hopeful. But there is that neocon core in the US that is still playing out this deeply diluted fantasy of global dominance. But the world is changing around them, right? They're not able to maintain that anymore. And so I think if we can get through this period, if we can bring this conflict to a close, if we can establish peace, that we are going to have, I think, the possibility for a better future, for a more equitable international order, a more peaceful international order, you know. But we're going to have to be really careful because twilight of empire is usually a very unstable and dangerous time. You know, will the U.S. understand that things are changing, that power is shifting, or will they lash out? You know, so to me, we have to make sure these conflicts don't become hot, and if they do become hot, we've got to control them as soon as possible and bring it in, bring peace to them. Thank you.